Hello, I'm Anavoltus, and today I will be talking about why I do not factor power into my discussion of the taxonomy of racial discrimination, or the categorization of different types of racial discrimination, and why I do not use power to be definitional to racism. Now, besides the obvious argument of if someone who is in power is racist and then suddenly they lose power, do they automatically cease being racist even if their views remain the same? I would also say that a major problem with looking at things in this way is that it automatically collectivizes races in the first place. And I don't really see that as being something that is necessarily true, because especially on a scientific level, you would have to prove to me that either there's a collective consciousness among an ethnic group, or that behavior is fully dependent on the genetics, and that this is then based upon ethnic groups, in which case one might say that there might be some type of racism, but neither of these things have been proven. So essentially what I'm saying is that although there may be some aspects of behavior that might be influenced by a certain portion of genetics, mostly people are their own persons. I am my own person, and I don't behave any particular way because of an ethnic group that I am in. I tend to side on the nurture side of the nature versus nurture debate on this issue. And therefore, when someone then says that a certain ethnic group collectively is this or is that, it doesn't really make sense to me, because the question I would ask is, how can you prove that every single person in that ethnic group is this way? And that obviously almost always is proven false, unless maybe you're dealing with an extremely small ethnic group that perhaps is in some way together in a sense, and then maybe there might be something where we might say that an entire ethnic group behaves the same way. But largely, when you get into a larger society, it's impossible to find any ethnic group where where every single member has the same opinion on a certain issue. I think that's largely impossible when you get into larger ethnic groups. And when I say larger ethnic groups, I'm talking about anything above maybe a dozen people. I think it's pretty hard to enforce an equal viewpoint into anything really larger than that, to be honest, because people tend to disagree on various issues for various reasons, and they may not be vocal in their disagreement, but it still happens. And so then the second component of this question of this power, why I do not insert power, is because I don't think it's necessary to have power to be racist. A big example, I would say, is the white supremacists who do not have power. And because they do not have power, they that is one of the reasons why I'm just going on to the Anti-Defamation League database. Okay. Well, this is something that the 1488ers, who are at least white nationalists, they might be white supremacists as well. There is a distinction, but the 14-word slogan that they have is, we must secure the existence, and I'm quoting here, of our people and a future for white children. What is that statement? That is not a statement that is coming from a position of power. It is a statement that is a defensive statement. Essentially, whoever makes a statement does not believe themselves to be the ones in power, because it's very defensive. We must secure the existence of our people. That means that they believe there's an existential threat that would destroy their people. And they must secure a future for their children, which means what that means is that they believe that their children do not have a future. In other words, this is a statement that inherently comes from an attitude of not having power. And this is the big statement of the white nationalists. Of course, many white nationalists aren't as memey as this. These are more of the Hitler followers. But even then, you see that these statements, they don't come from a position of power. So, and if you look at society as a whole in the United States, the KKK, nobody likes the KKK. It's very rare to find someone that likes the KKK. It's not politically acceptable to be a member of the KKK amongst even white people who the KKK largely lean upon. So to say that these people have power and are therefore racist because they have power and prejudice does not seem to be accurate in my estimation. Because number one, many of these individuals don't believe themselves to have power, and therefore you might say, well, they have power de facto, but even if you were to ask the question, do they have power de facto, they do not. The white nationalists are not in charge of the United States. Say what you will about Donald Trump, but he's not a white nationalist. He's not a white supremacist. I know that some of the media like to say that, and I don't like Donald Trump. Let me just be very clear. I don't like Donald Trump, but he is not a lot of these things that people accuse him of being. And how do I know that? Because I actually listen to what he says, and I listen to it in context, and I understand that when he says these things about various immigrants that the media then characterizes to be about that a general statement about all immigrants, he is actually specifically talking about the people that are committing the crimes. Because there are people that cross the border and they commit the crimes and they deal drugs and they do human trafficking. There are people that do that. There are people who don't, but there are people who do. And when he specifically addresses those people, then the media comes in and then they generalize that statement to mean to mean everyone. But anyway, back on track. If you were to say that power is necessary for something to be racist, then if anyone has the power, it would be, in Western societies nowadays anyway, it would be the SJWs. Well, not necessarily SJWs, but individuals who are more progressive, who are more up to date with critical race theory and intersectionality, for example. Those individuals are the individuals that politically are inside the Overton window, that those views are accepted as being acceptable by society in a political sense, as opposed to, let's say, the KKK and the white supremacists, who are type of racists that are not acceptable. And yes, I did just call individuals who practice intersectionality and critical race theory racist. And the reason I say that is because the way I define racism is that it requires prejudice, okay? Actually, no, not if it's in a scientific sense. But what it requires is fundamentally the collectivization of race. So it requires you to essentially do some sort of racial stereotype and buy into it. For example, and not necessarily a stereotype as to the qualities of individuals of a particular race, but also as to the responsibility of individuals of a particular race. So what they do on the progressive side of things is that they make an assumption that there is a general racial inequality when you look at the collectivized races, and although legally speaking, all individuals are required to be treated equally under the law, what they also now look at is more the equity side of things, saying, well, you look at the United States and you see that black people on average are poorer than white people. and they say, well, that doesn't that mean that there's something wrong going on? But that, of course, again, looking at it from an individualistic standpoint, what you would see is that there's some white people that are really, really poor, and there's some black people who are really, really rich. And you combine those, and you find out that there's a scale. And then the question is, when you look at the averages now, and you see that there are some black people who are on average poorer than white people, the question is, what is the cause of this? Is the cause of this that there's a conspiracy among white people to discriminate against black people? Or is the cause of this that maybe there's some cultural issues, some culture that has gotten in there? Now, I'm not saying that there aren't white people who are racist, because there obviously are. There is the KKK, and there are other white people who don't like black people for this, that, or the other reason. At the same time, there's also some individuals of color who behave in a manner that is not as conductive to economic prosperity as it is among other groups, such as, for example, the general hostility toward police that is present in some communities. That is generally not conducive to a healthy society, and likely raises the crime rate. Because if you don't think that the police are trustworthy, then it means that you're less likely to respect the police in other areas, and less likely to respect the law in other areas. And that, of course, raises the crime rate. And if you're living in a community where the crime rate is higher, you're obviously going to have to spend more money on security, or you might risk losing more money in theft and other issues. So the crime rate is generally higher. And there's also the issue of parenthood, where there are a large number of individuals who grow up without parents, and that is a factor that makes it more difficult for someone to developmentally mature. And there are individuals who get over this and who do very well, but there are many individuals who have a stunted development in some sense because of this. And because of that, of course leads to lower economic success. But essentially what I'm saying here is that you don't need to be in power to be racist. Because let's say you had a situation where eventually the United States becomes a country where whites are no longer the majority or even the plurality, and then you would what the intersectionals and the critical race theory folks would have to say then is that suddenly the KKK is not racist anymore because white people are not in power anymore. That doesn't make sense. It's just silly, because it's an ideology. It's an ideological form of racism. Racism is ideological, in my view, that it depends on one's own ideas and on taking a collectivized view of races, so that on an ideological level, you make that type of discrimination, which is usually largely prejudicial, where, for example, people would say, oh, look, there's some rich Jews, therefore all Jews are rich. And that's not true. Or people would say, oh, look, there's some white racists, therefore all whites are racist. That's not true. People would say, oh, look, there's some blacks that are criminals, therefore all blacks are criminals. That's also not true. And so you end up producing these stereotypes and applying them, and that's what I think is the fundamental part of racism. It's not to do with power, because I could insult someone and be very mean to someone who is above me in some sort of status, and that wouldn't justify my insults, because uh, even if you had a society that is stratified, where there is an upper class that exercises a particular type of oppression upon a lower class, does that really justify uh, any type of aggression from the lower class? Does it justify any type of aggression, even if it's disproportional, even if it is genocidal? I don't think it does. So I would still say that that classist type of argument, uh, that classism is something that is not limited to the upper classes, but is something that is also very common in the lower classes as well. And the same thing with racism. Racism is not something that is limited to ethnic groups that are more powerful, if you even view it that way. But it's something that is plausible among all ethnic groups, regardless of their average wealth, regardless of their average political power. And that's why I did not factor in power when I made my own taxonomy on racial discrimination. My own view is that this has to do with how someone thinks in the mind. Because if you're going to say that someone is doing something wrong, where does the evil deed originate? It originates in the mind. Because if it does not originate in the mind, if someone just does something, then it might be neglectful, it might be an accident, but it would not be someone intentionally doing something evil. And so when you say that racism is something evil, then therefore, in my view, it has to be something that originates in the mind, something that is premeditated, something that someone does intentionally and with knowledge of doing it. So the idea with racism then therefore is, it doesn't matter if you actually have power, because it's something that happens in your mind. That's just my opinion. And I'm not arguing for thought crimes, because I don't think that the government should really be trying to enforce anything that they don't have evidence of, because the government doesn't read people's minds. So, and even regarding speech, of course, there are problems if someone makes threats and things like that. But if someone says something that's rude, I don't think the government should really be going after someone that says they hate someone. Now, when that person actually begins making threats of violence or actually assaulting someone, then of course the government needs to step in there. But I say that similar to how you have lust, which is the part in the mind, and then that eventually comes out physically in various things, and you have hate, which might come out into a physical action. You can also have prejudice that then comes out in a physical action. And I'm saying that just because you don't have power doesn't mean you don't have prejudice. And therefore, just because you don't have power doesn't mean you're not a racist. But that's just my opinion. Tell me what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think that maybe there's another issue, another aspect of this that I did not take into account? I would be happy to hear it. So thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on A Wiltus. Over and out.